You may have noticed that I'm a little bit obsessed with testing out salt with watercolor. I do it in pretty much all my tests, and that is because I find salt reaction with watercolor absolutely fascinating. It has got me thinking though, through doing the Colossal Color Showdown and getting surprising results, what is the best way, what factors can we control to have the maximum amount of salt reaction in the way that we want it. So that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, obviously, factors that are involved in how salt reacts to a watercolor has so many factors that I can't cover all of them in this video. I'm going to narrow it down to a few factors for this video, but it might be a start of a mini series of us being super nerdy and testing out different factors. So please consider this as the first step in testing out how salt reacts with water. So for this video, I'm going to tell you the things I'm going to keep the same first. One is color, the particular watercolor that we're going to be using. The other is the paper. The other is the salt. We're only going to test table salt for this experiment. We already have tested lots of different salts, which I will leave up here or here, probably here, for you to check it out. That was really interesting. So we're going to keep it to just table salt. The paper is going to be Saunders and Waterford. I've already prepped a test table for you guys. And we're going to keep the water the same because obviously water has an effect on it as well. So for the paint, we are going to be using Holbein Indigo, and that's because I did a quick test to see which color would be good. I just needed one that reacts to salt, and I used the Phthalo Blue Yellow shade for these two by Holbein and Indigo by Holbein for here. And I was like, I'll probably get a reaction from the Phthalo Blue Yellow shade, but not the Indigo, and it's actually the other way around, which is interesting. I did forget that this Indigo is made with mostly Phthalo Blue, but yeah, it's really interesting that this is the one that reacted more than the Phthalo Blue. So we're going to go with the Indigo by Holbein for this test. We do also have a live stream of which color reacts to salt and which color doesn't. So I will leave a link up here as well for you guys to check out. So we're going to use Indigo by Holbein, Saunders and Waterford, which is a cotton paper, and obviously cellulose paper could react differently. The things that I am going to change are the amount of salt I add to a patch of water, or water and paint mix. Here is small amount of salt, medium amount of salt, and lots of salt. Another factor that I'm going to change is paint to water ratio. So on one side, we're going to have almost a mass stone where it's high ratio of paint and a little bit of water. And then we're going to have almost like a half and half paint and water mix. And then we're going to have lots of water with very little paint. So that's another thing we are going to test. And also, the reason why I have 3 sheets is because there's a third factor that I want to test out. That is how wet, like how much of the paint and water mixture I put down from almost dry brushing. Not quite dry brushing, because then I don't think you would get much reaction, but as dry as I would dare to go and still hope to get some reaction. And then we'll have an average amount that we wouldn't put down when we're painting normally. And then we have high wetness, which is going to be a lot more water and paint mixture on the paper than I would normally put down in a painting, and see if that affects it as well. So we're going to get on with making the 3 different mixture of paint and water in different ratios of paint to water. And then we can get on with the test. So we have 3 bowls here, and then we're going to put a little bit of water here, medium amount of water here, and lots of water here, and then the paint. I'm going to use this. This is just tap water from normal Edinburgh water. And in case you're wondering what this thing is, it's actually just a soy sauce decanter that you would have in any Japanese home on their dining table to have a little bit of soy sauce to add to their food. And I have one, but I wasn't using it as a soy sauce decanter, and I thought I could use it as a water decanter, and it's working really well. So if you ever wanted an easier way to decant some water in small amounts, I highly recommend using the soy sauce bottle. So in this one, I'm going to add a tiny bit of water, well, a little bit of water. And then in the middle one, I am going to add a bit more water. And then in the final one, I am going to add plenty of water. And then I have my big palette of indigo. So we'll just see, add some into here as well. Just get the paints going. So I only want a little bit of paint on this one with lots of water. So I'm just going to do that first. And I'm just going to swatch it to see how concentrated it is. Maybe a little bit more so we actually see something. I will come back and fiddle with these to balance them well. Let's make the medium one. That's pretty good. And then the really concentrated one, I'm just going to actually scoop all this wet paint. Really thick mixture of paint. That's nice. The only thing I'm going to adjust is I don't think I have enough of this. So I'm going to adjust everything to give me a little bit more amount of paint to water mixture. And just add more paint to this. So I've made 3 mixtures, very concentrated, so a lot more paint than they are over here and here. And then a medium amount and a relatively small amount of paint. Don't worry that there are different amounts of water here. I think the most important thing is that we get a different value out of this color, because that is a really good indicator on how much more paint there is on here than it is on here. So that is all the test sheets prepped now. I've painted the different concentration of paint on the bottom row. This paper is going to be the pretty dry sheet, which is when I'm going to put the least amount of paint and water mixture I can get away with. The medium wetness is going to be the normal amount of paint and water mixture that we normally would paint, or I would normally put down. And then a high wetness would be adding extra water to that. The bottom row of each sheet is going to be small amount of salt. Middle row is the medium amount of salt, and then the top row is going to be lots of salt. So I'm just going to get on with painting these, and then I'm going to let things dry, and then I'll come back to you with the result. is now the next day and the salts and the paints have all dried, and I'm absolutely fascinated by the result. But before we start taking a good look at them, I am just going to go and scrape all the salt off. And to do that, all I'm going to do is just use my palette knife. This is the Holbein Hard, but any pretty sturdy thing, palette knifey thin thing will do for scraping the salt off. Be gentle with it so that you don't scratch the paper off. But yes, I'm just going to go in and remove the salt. Well, that was really interesting. I noticed when I was scraping the salt off that the pretty dry and the medium wetness one were quite easy to remove the salt. They just came off with a light rubbing, whereas the high wetness one was the most interesting in terms of getting rid of the salt. The small amount of salt and the medium amount of salt had no salt crystals to scrape off. It's kind of just all dissolved into the water, whereas the lot of salt one with the higher wetness on all three concentration of paint, they were really difficult to remove the salt. I felt like the salt was still stuck. I can still feel salt on here, and it was just remarkably different to the other two kind of wetness. And then what's really interesting is that with this one, where the water puddled on this side, the salt had recrystallized into bigger crystals, and you have the marks of that on here as well. But these two came off very, very easily. Now, I think this was super interesting to do, and I'm really glad I did this test. So the pretty dry one and the medium one, I think, had the best result in terms of salt reaction. With the high wetness one, as I said, the salt kind of dissolved away. You get some reaction, and maybe that's what you're looking for, but you will definitely get a much better reaction, and probably the kind of reaction you're expecting if you can keep your paint dry. Or once you've painted, if you like to paint really wet, just let the paint soak in for a few minutes, not completely dry, but once the paint on the paper looks pretty flat and it looks absorbed, that's probably the better time to sprinkle your salt than when it's soaking wet. What was also really interesting, because I checked in on these as they dried, I got pretty much an immediate result from the pretty dry ones. But these two weren't doing anything, and I was freaking out that I might have done something wrong. But as they eventually dried in steps, so this one dried second, I could see the salt reacting to it more, and then this a lot later on, because it had a lot more water to evaporate first, I could see some of the reaction happening. So depending on how much water is still on the paper, don't worry if salt doesn't appear to have done anything. If you know you've chosen the colors that will react to salt, just let it dry completely is what I would suggest with using salt at any point. Is if you put down a layer and put a sprinkle of salt, let the whole thing dry completely so that you can actually see the full effect of the salt that you're going to get. What I can also say is putting a lot of salt, and it's quite vague as to what small, medium and lots of salt is. Please think of small amount as just few sprinkle, very light sprinkle of few grains here and there. The medium amount of salt is what I would call kind of covering the area, but only lightly, and you might have gaps in other places. And then lots of salt is just piling the salt on so that you have not just one layer of salt, but probably like a little couple layers, 2-3 layers of salt in some places. That's the kind of thing we're thinking of. So this is like a tiny pinch, not even a pinch, just few grains here and there. This is like a light pinch, and this was like a big pinch. And so with the big pinch of salt, so way too much salt, in all conditions, you don't really get that much reaction because there's just too much salt. So that's great to know that you do need to be sparse with your salt to get the better results. You just need to give that salt the breathing room to do its thing. In terms of medium amount of salt, the most amazing reaction, I think, is the pretty dry medium amount of salt with small amount of paint in the mix. This is just like something else compared to everything else. It's like you can see where the salt's been, and it's got little flares of paint and all these arms going through. This is just like an explosion, and I think that is fascinating. It's not what we normally expect from a salt, but I'm pretty sure someone can make really good use of this look somewhere, and I'm definitely going to play with this because it was just fascinating. I think the more concentrated a paint is, the more dramatic a look you can get from the salt. Like with these two, it's so dark. The salt set kind of pushes some of the darker pigments out, and you get this really contrasting result. Whereas with the dry, almost dry kind of look, it's got the same amount of concentration of paint, but because this has more of the paint water mixture, what ends up happening is once it's dry, this will come up darker because it does have more paint, if you think about it. If that makes sense, let me go over that again. These two uses the same amount of concentration, but the volume of the paint and water mixture, this one obviously has more because this is the wetter one. That, and by the time all the water dries, all we have left is the paint that we put on the paper. And so what ends up happening is, even though the concentration at the time when the salt goes on is the same, we get more paint dried onto the paper than we do here. So you just end up getting a more dramatic look. I also feel that these wetter one, the medium wetness, had more breathing room to let the salt do its magic more. So for example here, with the pretty dry ones, you get the effect, but it's pretty localized. Whereas here, you get loads of veins happening, and this is amazing here. It's got so many veins happening. So I feel like salt needs a small to medium amount of salt so that it has plenty of breathing room, and then a little bit of wetness so that that effect, the chemical reaction, can have the breathing room to take more effect and travel through that water. I'm sure chemists that are watching this are dying with my non-chemistry description of what's happening. I am not a chemist, so I don't know the chemical reactions that are happening here. I'm just letting you know what I'm observing, which is what this channel is about. I do experiments, and then I let you know what I see. The question is, does paint concentration matter? And I think it does, because when you look at the pretty dry one, I think you can see the effect more, both in the medium amount of salt and the small amount of salt. The least concentrated one, the lightest one, the effect is much bigger. And I think you can see it best here on the medium amount, that as the concentration of the paint gets higher, the reaction or the size of those veins gets smaller. And I think it's the same here, in that you get really good vein here, whereas the veins get just too much and everything gets blurred out around here. So if you want a really big amount of reaction, then use lighter colors. However, it might be too light, like in the case here with the medium wetness. It might be that you do want more paint in there just so that you get to have that veiny effect. But that's really good, because whether you like to leave it till it's almost dry or you want to put the salt down straight away, you can just adjust. You know that if you paint dark, you can just put salt in there straight away, whereas if you paint pretty pale, then I recommend you let that paint area dry a little bit so that it's a more pretty dry state, and then put the salt down, and then you get more of that really cool reaction happening. So you can adjust your timing of when you put salt on depending on the concentration or the value of the paint that you are putting down on the paper. I think ultimately, which setup of wetness, amount of salt, and the concentration of paint to water depends on the kind of reaction you want. If you want super dramatic and super veiny look, then a high concentration of paint with medium wetness and medium amount of salt looks great. But you might be looking for something like that, or just a few bits here and there, but slightly flared, then a pretty dry and small amount of salt with light amount of paint will be great. So the biggest thing I'm going to take away from this is, one, if you use loads of water, do let the paint dry. Two, the timing of, if I want the same kind of reaction from different levels of concentration of paint, so if I want the same kind of result whether I do darker painting or lighter painted area, then I just got to tweak when I put the salt down, so that if it's a dark area, I know I can put the salt in straight away, and if it's a light area, it's better to just let things dry a little bit and then put the salt in, because otherwise, if it's still wet and it's light value, then it's just gonna blur too much out and you're not gonna see that veiny effect. And I think those are really, really useful information. What did you think of this test result? Do let me know in the comments down below which one of these you like the best, which is the one that you traditionally think of as the result you get from salt, and which one actually surprised you. I am most surprised by the pretty dry, low amount of paint concentration and medium amount of salt. I think that is just like, wow, I didn't know salt can do that. So I would say, in summary, be moderate with your wetness, or if you like to paint wet, let things dry a little bit. Do be moderate with your salt, don't put loads of it on. Like, I kind of been doing that with my Glossy Clay Showdown, so that's a good thing to know, that I just need to go a little bit lighter on the salt. And then adjust your salt timing depending on how dark or light the area that you want to put the salt is in. I hope this test was useful to you. If it has been, then do please hit the like button. If there are other factors you want me to test, please do let me know. I am more than happy to do more salt tests, because I am fascinated by how salt and watercolor reacts to each other. I'm aware that there are other variables that I should test anyway, but if you can think of some, that would be absolutely awesome. This is a collaborative project. And of course, I have to say that this test result is only valid for this particular setup. So that is using the Saunders Waterfoot cold press 100% cotton 300 GSM paper, and using Indigo by Holbein, and using Edinburgh tap water, and using just a table salt. Results may vary if you change any of the variables there. So it might be fun for you guys to try out this test at home yourself and share it with me over on my Instagram, which is at @autokano_art. That would be absolutely awesome. You can just not do this high wetness thing. I think we can just rule this conditioner out, or something that doesn't work well for salt tests. So you can just do these 2 sheets if you like, and let me know which setup is best for you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope it was fun for you guys, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!